Tonight, cyber attacks, the threat to the U.S. as criminals and state actors alike find new ways to hack interconnected systems.
In the one case, they actually attacked a recent updated patch into the system, and that led to a vulnerability which then was exploited.
Plus, judicial overhaul. Israel's Knesset passes Prime Minister Netanyahu's reasonableness law amid mass protests. And Sound of Freedom.
God's children are not for sale.
The surprise summer hit from Angel Studios. All this and more tonight on Faith Nation. Growing concern over supply chain security. Good evening in Washington. I'm Jenna Browder. In today's technology-driven world, hackers are targeting businesses and governments alike. Two recent cyber attacks highlight how, showing how bad actors can attack vulnerable third-party vendors. These vendors work for standalone companies or federal agencies. And once hackers find a way into their data, they have access to their entire customer base. The CBN News national security correspondent Caitlin Burke has more in tonight's top story. Caitlin, this kind of hacking is called a cyber supply chain attack. What are some examples?
Jenna, experts say you're only as strong as your weakest link. And they're sending this message following two recent attacks on the cyber supply chain. In the first, Chinese hackers targeted an email security provider. And in the other, Russian hackers infiltrated a file transfer program used by the federal government.
What these organizations did, or these governments engaged in, was finding the vulnerabilities in those particular software packages. In the one case, they actually attacked a recent updated patch into the system, and that led to a vulnerability which then was exploited.
The SolarWinds cyber attack back in 2020 remains the highest profile example of this kind of strategy. Hackers placed malware on signed versions of software from the IT management system supplier and then used it to gain access to 18,000 government and private organizations. Scott White, director of George Washington University's cybersecurity program, says this supply chain hack is being used not only by criminals, but also by APTs, or advanced persistent threats, like China, Russia, and North Korea.
We have to remember that every single day, these APTs are engaging in the cyber world, attempting to find vulnerabilities in any of the hardware or software that's being developed. Once they occur, then they can infiltrate those and eventually exfiltrate information.
White adds, protection against this kind of attack is especially difficult because hackers could gain access at any point across very interconnected systems.
The problem we run into ultimately is not every organization in that supply chain, from manufacturer to distributor right down to user, is going to have the same level of security, the same level of cyber hygiene.
That's especially true for global supply chains, with many countries not requiring the same security standards as the U.S.
Part of what we have to do, both as a government and as business, is continue to push kind of not necessarily regulation, but at least standards and practices to the global community who want to engage in the supply chain.
Research shows why securing these critical supply chains is so important. According to Gartner, Inc., 45% of global organizations can expect a software supply chain attack by 2025. White says the federal government already offers resources to help U.S. organizations examine their various member networks and come up with a risk management process.
Risk management is not just placing in security and good hygiene. Risk management also looks at threat vectors. And when you're looking at threat vectors, you're also looking at where are we connected? What third parties are we engaging in?
While these specific attacks don't always make headlines, they must be taken seriously. In 2022 alone, more than 10 million people and some 1,700 organizations fell victim to a cyber supply chain breach. And that number is expected to rise in the future. Jenna?
And Caitlin, with these attacks on the rise, what are some practical steps companies can take?
The biggest thing to do is significant research before implementing any new technology, whether that's a file transfer program, an email provider, or a new network security system. Make sure that service provider has good security practices, monitors their product, and is continually making the upgrades necessary to keep it secure. It might mean paying more money for a higher-end product, but it will help protect the entire network. Jenna?
All right, great information. National security correspondent Caitlin Berg, thank you. And turning overseas, Israel is on high alert tonight after Parliament passed the first key part of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's judicial reform law. The lead up to today's vote has been marked by protests that are expected to continue in the coming days. Hillary Powell has more on why demonstrations against the controversial measure are likely to forge ahead.
With shouts of shame, Israeli lawmakers opposed to a controversial vote on national judicial reform stormed out of the Knesset chamber Monday, allowing for a unanimous 64-0 vote. Approved is a key portion of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plan, removing the right for the High Court to strike down a law passed by the Knesset if they decide that law is unreasonable. Carrying Israeli flags, tens of thousands of upset protesters spoke with their feet. Some blocked traffic in both directions on a road in Jerusalem, in some of the biggest protests in Israeli history. The opposition leader put words to their actions, saying today is a show of weakness by Prime Minister Netanyahu that has never been seen before. There is no prime minister in Israel.
This is probably the most heart-wrenching time for Israelis, and a deep division within Israeli society about this. One added note, Hillary, is the fact that many people believe there are outside influences and outside funding behind these protests, and that the ultimate goal is not just to prevent judicial reform from being enacted, but also that it would eventually lead to the downfall of the government.
In a statement from the White House, President Joe Biden called it unfortunate that the vote today took place with the slimmest possible majority. Part of the plan proposed as a sweeping reform by Netanyahu's nationalist government is divisive. Critics say it would mark a move away from democratic ideals. Supporters say it would roll back power from unelected judges and also rein in a runaway Supreme Court.
Now, the problem may come is that the Supreme Court may say that this law is unreasonable. And then you're going to have a crisis of which branch of government is going to prevail.
President Biden says via statement that he expects ongoing talks in the coming weeks to reach a compromise, even with the Knesset in recess. In Washington, Hillary Powell, CBN News.
Thank you, Hillary. And Joel Rosenberg is the host of the Rosenberg Report on TBN and a New York Times best-selling author, and he is also based in Israel. Joel, welcome. Great to see you this evening. So give us some context here. Why is this judicial reform measure such a big deal?
Jenna, great to be with you. And I got to say, unfortunately, I'm in British Columbia, Canada right now, not in Jerusalem, but I'm watching things very closely. Look, this is a big deal because basically the Supreme Court and most of the court system in Israel has really turned to the left and has really been handing down decisions that are not consistent with the democratic views of the Israeli people. And so one of the problems is in this judicial activism. We see it in the United States here, where you are as well. But judicial activism it can be a runaway train, right? So the question is, what should the law say that the courts are allowed to decide? Israel doesn't have a constitution, so that makes it complicated. Real quickly, this reasonableness standard, I haven't seen the English text yet, okay? So I have to be careful. We're going to publish that on All Israel News in the next couple of days and really look at it carefully. But the short version is the Supreme Court has just decided it can decide if a law is reasonable or a government decision is reasonable or not. But there is literally no law in Israel that says the Supreme Court can decide what's reasonable. And that's a pretty vague standard, right? What's reasonable? Just because 9 court people in robes say it's unreasonable? Is it? So this is a huge debate, but I think it's an important one.
Yeah. We're seeing protests over there. Recent years, we of course have seen many, our fair share here in America, be it Black Lives Matter, Antifa, white nationalists, or any variety of different groups. What's the difference, Joel, between protesters in Israel and protesters in America?
Well, there is a genuine fear in Israel that that this whole overall judicial reform package, of which the reasonableness standard is just one slice of it, is going to fundamentally alter Israeli democracy. The opponents of all this say it's going to end democracy in Israel, the only real democracy in the Middle East, and then you'll have basically a dictatorship. I don't think that's right. I don't think that's a fair argument. I think the opposite is true. What you've got is the courts have been hijacking the democracy of the Israeli people when they vote for their leaders to vote for certain, legislation. And the Supreme Court says that's unreasonable. Based on what? Like, there are other standards, right? This either violates this law or it violates this administrative code or what. That's how courts should decide in the absence of a constitution. So I think what's happening is you've got people who are scared. And I'm not saying it's not genuine. Some people hate Bibi Netanyahu anyway, and they just want to get rid of him at all costs. But there are other Israelis who are like, no, Netanyahu's fine, but they are fearful that this whole judicial reform thing will go off the rails. And that's creating the most tension I have ever seen domestically in Israel. We get worried about our threats from Iran, but we've never seen this level of tension inside Israel ever.
Yeah. Speaking of tension, it's affecting the military. Some 10,000 reservists in the Israel Defense Forces have threatened to end their volunteer duty because of this, of the overhaul plans. Just 30 seconds left, Joel, but just a quick thought on that.
That's dangerous. And that's unreasonable. Look, if you are serving in a military, in a democracy, and the democratically elected government passes a law, it's not a military officer or combat soldier or fighter pilots. It's not their province to say, I'm not going to serve. I mean, if you're legally allowed to quit, okay, you quit. But this is dangerous when a military says, I won't obey the orders of the democratically elected government. That's a risk to democracy.
All right, Joel, we are out of time, unfortunately. Joel Rosenberg, thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy your time in British Columbia.
Thank you. God bless you.
Well, The Sound of Freedom, shocking at the box office. An inside look at the studio behind the surprise summer hit. Next on Faith Nation. Welcome back. The film Sound of Freedom is the surprise of the summer, I should say, making more than $100 million since opening earlier this month. Just over the weekend, the movie brought in more than $20 million in ticket sales, coming in third at the box office. The faith-based film about human trafficking has sold nearly 9 million tickets to date. It's one of two films produced by an independent studio that opened in the top 3 over the past few months. And as Ephraim Graham explains, Angel Studios says their secret to success is letting the audience decide what projects get the green light.
God's children are not for sale.
Sound of Freedom is a July surprise that could be the summer shocker.
Isaac and I would go with him.
Why, Isaac? In April, his only son scored headlines, opening at number 3, with nearly 6 million in ticket sales, after being made for only 250,000.
Throw this down for a catch.
I don't have a quarrel with you, teacher.
And then there's The Chosen, the record-making crowd-funded series that Lionsgate picked up for worldwide distribution in May, after 3 successful seasons without Hollywood support. The engine behind these upsets isn't in New York or LA. It's 43 miles south of Salt Lake City, Provo, Utah. Population, about 120,000. A land of towering mountains and waterfalls, and home to Angel Studios, where brothers Jeffrey and Neil Harmon are disrupting the entertainment world, putting power in the hands of the people. But it's been an uphill climb.
When we last sat here some 5 years ago, you were faced with a lawsuit. Let's go back to that time. What What was it like? What do you remember?
Well, at the time, I was terrified when I first saw the lawsuit and shocked that it was Disney. But I remember distinctly getting up in front of, how many people did we have at that time? Probably, I don't know how many. It was around 50 people on the team, 40 to 50. I remember standing up and saying to people, I'm not exactly sure how this is going to turn out, but I believe that the audience, we, and Hollywood would be better off for it.
Disney sued the Harmon's VidAngel platform for copyright infringement because it gave home audiences the ability to filter out what they didn't want to see or hear in its films.
When we were in trial, the #2 guy at Disney was there the entire week, and their half of the room was filled with suits of sophisticated lawyers and people watching, and our half of the room was a measly crowd. And then the families would come in and sit down and cheer for us, and then they'd have to leave, or children would come and
little
cheer
Orthodox Jewish families would come in and sit down and be like, "You can do it. You can do it."
And so it's like this sea of high billing hours against, you know, the margins of Hollywood society.
How and why did you survive?
We should have lost. We really should have, and but we didn't, and we can't take credit for that. It was a mixture of families like those stepping up and putting up $10 million for us to fight the battle.
And as far as I'm aware, we're the only company that's ever survived, like a startup company that's ever survived a big lawsuit like this from Disney.
So how are things different today? How big is Angel Studios? How many projects do you have? What's all happening here now?
Leaving bankruptcy, we were at somewhere in the 30 range, maybe 38 people. Today, we're at over 140. When Disney sued us, we did $8 million. Last year, we did 120.
We got a bunch of projects coming.
Let's look at the new project lineup for 2023. All right, Tempest. This is based on a sea monster. It's an animated series.
And a familiar formula is at work. A team of 100,000 Angel viewers screened hundreds of submissions, then voted to decide what Angel Studios produces and raises the money to fund. Like The Shift, starring Neil McDonough.
1,000 versions of you in 1,000 different worlds, all working for me. Where's my wife? I shifted her.
How did you know that giving the power to the audience would work?
It was intuitive. We grew up on farms in Idaho, and it was just intuitive.
In 2016, it wasn't intuitive to anybody else. It was just intuitive. We believed that if you give people ownership, Neil gives the example of owning versus renting in a home, you know. So we had this idea that we can raise money through the crowd, and because they own part of the network, they're way more conscious and want the network to work, and they're helping market us and defend us. And so we have 12,000 investors who invested in Angel Studios.
It was also intuitive just because when we were growing up, our parents would share with us films, but they were very select few that we could watch. And we have young children ourselves, and we just said, yeah, I mean, what we see being created isn't what we want to experience with our family. And so if we ask the families what they want made, we just felt like that would mirror more what we want to see made.
It's not the Hollywood model for movie making. It's the Harmon model, and it's working. Ephraim Graham, CBN News, Provo, Utah.
All right, thank you, Ephraim. Well, is Texas taking border security too far? That's what the Justice Department is trying to determine with a new investigation into migrant treatment at the southern border. It stems from complaints from Texas authorities over border conditions, citing things like denying migrants drinking water or pushing people into the Rio Grande River. 80 Democratic lawmakers recently signed a letter to President Biden calling border policies barbaric. Meanwhile, the DOJ is threatening to sue the Lone Star State, saying the state has until the end of today to remove floating buoys used as a barrier to block illegal immigrants crossing the Rio Grande. Governor Greg Abbott tweeted his response saying, quote, "We will see you in court, Mr. President." And we'll be right back with more Faith Nation after this. Welcome back. Much of America sweating it out with no end in sight as a deadly heat wave continues across the country. With tens of millions of Americans under the heat alerts, the high temperatures aren't letting up and they are breaking records in some places. In Phoenix, today marked the 25th straight day of highs over 110 degrees. In the Dallas area, 4 people have died due to the hot weather. And the heat at home comes as the globe itself has endured the hottest 2 weeks ever recorded.
Feel hotter this year compared to any of the other years. I don't remember it being this hot when I was a kid.
In the past week or two, if we look at the global temperature around the world, we very likely had the hottest days in recorded history.
Yeah, it's a scorcher. 86 major U.S. cities will face dangerous levels of heat this week. The life and legacy of Emmett Till will soon be honored with a national monument. President Biden is set to sign a proclamation tomorrow announcing the establishment of the Emmett Till and Mamie Till Mobley National Monument. The murder of the 14-year-old Mississippi teen and his mother's work afterward helped spark the civil rights movement. Emmett was killed after being accused of flirting with a white woman. Her husband and half-brother were charged with the murder, but both were acquitted by a jury of all white men. The new monument will include 2 locations, one at the Chicago church where Emmett Till's funeral was held in 1955, and the other in Mississippi at the courthouse where the now admitted murderers were cleared of the crime. All right, still ahead, a giant panda party in Washington, D.C. You're watching CBN's Faith Nation. Finally tonight, a special treat for visitors at the Smithsonian National Zoo in Washington, D.C., and one of their giant pandas. Mei Xiang celebrated her 25th birthday on Saturday with a heat-appropriate treat, a blue fruit-sickle cake shaped in the number 25. The tiered cake was made of frozen apple juice, sweet potatoes, and decorated with, of course, bamboo. The National Zoo noting Mei Xiang is well into old age for a giant panda, most living until about 30 years old. And happy birthday. That's going to do it for tonight. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow.